Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome friends to this third lecture of week 2 of this NPTEL online certification course of soil fertility and fertilizers, and in this week we are talking about soil nitrogen for plant nutrition. We are going to start our lecture 8 or third lecture of week 2, and in our previous 2 lectures of this week we have discussed about the we discussed about what are the different inorganic forms and organic forms of nitrogen present in the environment, and how they how they are related to plant nutrition, what are the available forms, and what we have also seen the nitrogen cycle, and also we have seen we have discussed some of the important nitrogen processes in the soil like mineralization, then nitrification, and also some sub-steps within the mineralization like aminization, ammonification, and also we have discussed briefly about denitrification and also volatilization. We have seen the importance of carbon to nitrogen ratio for determining the determining the mineralization as well as immobilization. We have also discuss the impact of different environmental factors like temperature and moisture or nitrification process. So, in this lecture we are going to cover this lecture. First of all, stages of the nitrogen cycle. Also we are going to discuss the levels of nitrogen available to plants based on microbial decomposition. We are also going to discuss factors of nitrate leaching and factors controlling nitrous oxide emission from soils, and finally different nitrogen loss mechanisms. So, these are the major concepts which we are going to cover in this week, and also these are the keywords which we are going to discuss: denitrification loss, nitrous oxide emission, ammonia volatilization, eutrophication, and nitrogen uptake. So, if we see the details of soil nitrogen cycle, we have already discussed important processes. So, for example, there are different types of nitrogen inputs like fertilizers as well as atmospheric deposition. We have discussed this in details, and then from there we have plant uptake, and also from the organic form of nitrogen gets converted into inorganic forms by mineralization process, and we get the ammonium from, and this ammonium form is either exchange and fixed in soil minerals, or they undergo immobilization process and convert back to organic form of nitrogen. Some amounts of ammonium nitrogen will convert to nitrite as well as nitrate through the process of nitrification, and you know that there are several bacteria which are responsible for from ammonium to nitrite. Nitrosomonas is responsible, and from nitrite to nitrate, nitrobacter is responsible, and this nitrate is either uptaken by the plant, or they are lost from the soil through the leaching process, or they are back to the atmosphere by denitrification process in anaerobic condition. So, ultimately they produce the nitrous oxide, and finally, due to the denitrification process they convert back into atmospheric nitrogen, and this ammonium is also converted they also released into the atmosphere through ammonia volatilization processes. So, these are the different stages of a nitrogen cycle. We have discussed this already in details. Now, let us see some important concepts for nitrogen immobilization. Now, immobilization on the temporary tying up of nitrogen. So, basically immobilization can be termed as a temporary tying up of inorganic nitrogen by soil microorganisms decomposing plant residues. So, it is not a strictly loss process. So, we cannot tell that immobilization is a strictly loss of nitrogen, as we can say in case of leaching. Why? So, immobilized nitrogen will be unavailable to the plants for a time, but will eventually become available as residues decomposition proceeds and population of microorganisms decline. So, what happens that when immobilized are basically immobilization can occur in the microbes body. So, when the microbes die, they decompose, their organic nitrogen decompose and further goes back to the environment as inorganic form of nitrogen. So, fertilizer nitrogen immobilization can be reduced by placing fertilizer below crop residues instead of incorporating fertilizer into the soil with residues. So, generally this strategy is being used for reducing the nitrogen immobilization. So, the producer can accomplish this most directly by knifing in anhydrous ammonia or solution. So, here you can see that this graph is showing the activity of changes in the activity of microorganism and plant available nitrate supply with respect to time. So, you can see temporal variation of these two aspects. So, we can see when we are adding organic material, so activity of the microorganisms will increase, because organic matter will serve as a source of carbon, or in other words source of energy for them. So, you will see that there is a boom of microbial population here, but at the same time plant available nitrate supply will decline, because they will when there is a when there is a population increase of microorganisms, they will utilize this plant available nitrogen to immobilize, and ultimately you will see there is a sudden decrease of plant available nitrogen supply. However, with the passage of time, the population will further decrease with a concomitant increase in plant available nitrate supply, because when the population will die, the decomposition process will convert these organic form of nitrogen into further back to inorganic form. So, that is why the plant available nitrate supply will also increase. So, this is how this there is this immobilization is dependent on microbial population and also presence of plant available and presence of different types of organic material, and of course, to CN ratio. Now, remember that the duration of the nitrate depression period during this immobilization, we can see here this is the nitrate depression period. So, the duration of the nitrate depression period during immobilization depends on environmental factors such as moisture and temperature and the CN ratio of the residue. And we have discussed this in details, why when there is a high CN ratio, why there is immobilization, we have already discussed. So, remember that soil organic matter contains an average about 50% of carbon and 5% nitrogen. So, the CN ratio is 10:1. So, it is relatively constant for organic matter. Now, the CN ratio of plant residue ranges from this 10:1 for young leguminous plant tissue to as high as 200:1 for straw or some grains. So, plant tissue low in nitrogen generally are more resistant to decomposition and require a longer time before the nitrogen is available to the plants. So, these are some practical implication of denitrification of immobilization process. Now, the next important process in the nitrogen cycle is denitrification process. So, when the soil is saturated with water, that will remove all the air which are occupied there in the pore space. So, in saturating a soil with water will create an anaerobic condition, and in this anaerobic condition whatever nitrate is there in the soil will convert back to the different various gaseous forms of nitrogen, which will be ultimately lost to the atmosphere. So, first it will convert into the nitrate will convert into nitric oxide, then nitrous oxide, and then dinitrogen. So, this process is known as denitrification. If you see that the name itself suggests it is a conversion of nitrate to other forms. So, it is denitrification. Now, denitrification occurs under oxygen limiting condition, as I have already mentioned, when anaerobic bacteria use nitrate in respiration in the presence of carbon sources such as organic matter. So, in the anaerobic condition there is no oxygen available for these bacteria. So, they utilize this nitrate and then they reduce this nitrate back to different gaseous form and ultimately to nitrogen gas. So, low field areas which are subject to ponded water for sustained period during the irrigation season often exhibit nitrogen deficiencies related to denitrification losses. So, of course, when there is a low lying soil area which are saturated with water or ponded water, that will create anaerobic condition, and of course, in this anaerobic condition there will be conversion of nitrate to nitrogen gas. So, here you can see first nitrate will convert into nitrogen dioxide, then nitric oxide, then nitrous oxide, and finally to nitrogen gas, and ultimately they will release back to the atmosphere. So, this process is the denitrification process. Now, denitrification losses from saturated soil will vary with temperature and the amount of carbon or organic matter which is available. So, here you can see for different time days like 3 days, 5 days and 10 days, if the temperature is 75 to 80 degrees. So, we can see that nitrogen loss is only 6%. However, if the temperature is more conducive for the bacterial growth, we can see 10 to 25%. So, as the time increases and if the temperature is favorable for the growth of the microbes, then we can see that increased nitrogen loss through denitrification process. So, of course, this denitrifying bacteria becomes inactive when there is a high temperature. So, this as I have already told you, this denitrification basically mediated through anaerobic microorganisms which convert this nitrate to nitrous oxide and finally to nitrogen gas. So, also when these different types of gases like nitrous oxide released back into the atmosphere, they can create different types of hazardous climatic effects in troposphere and stratosphere. So, here we can see that these nitrous oxide, or in other words these NOx or nitrogen oxides are interfering with the ozone layer in the stratosphere, and ultimately they are causing some damages in the stratosphere. Similarly, nitrous oxide has its effect on troposphere also. So, if we see the the snapshot of this nitrogen cycle again, we are sure that this nitrogen fixation goes through either through industrial process from air or through rhizobium through symbiotic nitrogen fixation, and also through free living nitrogen fixing bacteria like azotobacter. So, all they basically fix the nitrogen atmospheric nitrogen into organic forms, and of course, these nitrogen and from the industrial process, the nitrogen fertilizer, and from this rhizobium, ultimately it goes through soil organic matter, and from nitrogenous fertilizer it also goes through different processes. And also you can see here denitrification occurs in the reverse direction of nitrification. So, this nitrogenous fertilizer, first it will convert it to ammonium form, and this ammonium will go back to the nitrite, and this nitrite will go to the nitrate. These nitrate will be uptaken by the plant, or they will be lost by leaching, or they can go back to the atmosphere by the denitrification process. So, this is how and from the soil organic matter, the source of soil organic matter is the bodies of microorganisms, plants as well as animals. So, this is how, I mean, when we go for the crop harvest, that will remove the nitrogen through harvesting. So, this is called crop removal. And here you can see fixation of nitrogen by from rainfall, and so different types of nitrogen mechanisms are described in this slide. Okay. So, the nitrous oxide emission are generally governed by 4 major factors. One is rapid change in temperature, of course, and rapid changes in carbon, rapid changes in oxygen, and rapid changes in nitrogen. So, rapid changes in carbon, like addition of manure, then grazing, addition of crop residues, freezing, thawing, these will impact the nitrous oxide emission. Also, rapid changes in oxygen, like when there is a rainfall, increased amount of rainfall will also help in nitrous oxide emission. Then groundwater fluctuation, organic carbon inputs, all these will play an important role for nitrous oxide emission. Then finally, rapid changes in nitrogen, like fertilizer application, manure application, grazing and crop residues, these also have significant impact on nitrous oxide emission. So, these are major factors which are controlling the nitrous oxide emission. So, in this 2 plot we can see that irrigation or soil moisture and fertilizer rates both controls the nitrous oxide emission from the soil. So, in this plot we can see that in the x axis we have plotted the hours, and the y axis we have plotted the nitrous oxide emission. So, here this blue line shows 100 kg of nitrogen with water, 12.5 millimeter of irrigation, and here this red line is showing 100 kg of nitrogen without irrigation. So, of course, when there is a moisture, that will increase the anaerobic condition, and that will increase or augment the nitrogen denitrification and nitrous oxide emission. Similarly, the total nitrogen application rate, as we increase from 0 to 50 to 100 to 150, then 200 to 300, we can see there is concomitant changes or increase in total nitrous oxide emission also. So, that shows the impact of total application as well as the moisture in the soil. Now, what is ammonia volatilization? Ammonia, when it lost, when there is a loss of ammonia into the atmosphere, that is called ammonia volatilization. Technically, this ammonia volatilization is different from gaseous loss of applied anhydrous ammonia, which is not retained in the soil. Instead, ammonia volatilization occurs when ammonium in the soil, because of the pH is the major controlling factor. So, because of pH is converted to ammonia, which is lost as gas. So, due to the high pH, when ammonium ion which is present in the soil converts into ammonia gas, which is lost to the atmosphere, this is called ammonia volatilization. Now, ammonia volatilization is normally only a problem with fertilizers containing urea, such as urea or urea ammonium nitrate solutions. Now, what happens when urea is decomposed or hydrolyzed and enzymatically in soil to ammonium? So, here you can see this is an urea which is hydrolyzed to form the ammonium ion, and these ammonium ion in the alkaline condition they will convert into ammonia gas and then will release back to the atmosphere to and that will be called ammonia volatilization. The another important nitrogen loss pathway of nitrogen loss is nitrogen leaching, specifically nitrate leaching, because nitrate is among this is a major inorganic form of nitrogen which is generally lost by leaching. Now, for leaching nitrogen must be in water soluble mobile form and abundant enough to transport nitrogen through the soil. Now, although urea and nitrite are mobile, neither exist in significant concentration in soil. Nitrate is the nitrogen form most susceptible to leaching. So, nitrate leached below the root zone, that is 4 to 6 feet, for most agronomic crops will eventually leach downward until it reaches a saturated zone. Nitrate leached below 4 to 6 feet is generally unrecoverable. So, we cannot recover it back by most crops except deep rooted species. So, the rate of nitrate movement downward depends on a variety of factors, for example, soil texture, precipitation and irrigation amounts and crop uptake of water and nitrate. So, if we see there is a coarse textured soil, for example, sandy soils, which is overlying a coarse texture vadose zone. You know what is a vadose zone? Vadose zone is a zone of material between the surface and the water table. So, if there is a nitrate leaching issue in this sandy soil, coarse sandy soil, and of course, if there is a shallow aquifer, they can leave the root zone and enter the aquifer in a matter of months. On the contrary, from upland silt loam soil overlying, which is overlying an aquifer of 100 feet or more, that will take 25 to 30 years to reach the aquifer for the nitrate. So, depending on soil texture and also the amount of water present, the nitrate movement basically changes from one soil to another soil. Nitrate leaching is more in case of coarse texture soil. So, here you can see this is an experimental results where you can see nitrogen leaching effect in the vadose zone of irrigated continuous corn and pasture. So, you can see here this is the nitrate leaching for pasture, and here this is the nitrogen leaching, nitrate leaching for corn. Now, next important issue with nitrogen is eutrophication. Now, eutrophication is an environmental problem and it generally occurs when the water body, any water body becomes very rich with these nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, that will support the bloom of algae, ultimately exhausting all the dissolved oxygen and creating an oxygen depleted condition. We are going to discuss that in detail. So, what are the stages of the eutrophication? There are generally 4 stages of the eutrophication. First stage, you can see this is the excess of nutrients. Suppose you are applying huge amount of NPK fertilizer in the soil and the ground, and it will so that will go to the that will ultimately go to the water body. Second step is some nutrients become dissolved in water and leach or leak into the deeper soil layers. Eventually, they get drained into the water body such as lake or pond. So, here you can see this is the second pathway. Third is some nutrients run off from over the soil and ground directly into the water. So, this is the third. Fourth one is the extra nutrient causes algae to bloom. So, there will be an algal bloom when there is an excess amount of nutrient in the water body. Then in the fifth step, sunlight becomes blocked by the algae when there is a, so of course, we can see the sunlight is getting blocked by this algal bloom. So, this is called algal bloom, and when there is an algal bloom, photosynthesis and growth of plants under the water will be weakened or potentially stopped. Next, the algae bloom dies and falls to the bottom of the water body. Then bacteria begin to decompose and break down the remains and use up all the oxygen in the process. So, whatever oxygen were dissolved in the water, the bacteria will eat up all these oxygen. So, the decomposition process caused the water to have reduced oxygen, leading to dead zone. So, this is the eutrophication process, and when there is a dead zone, all the organisms which are present in the water will be negatively impacted because of loss of dissolved oxygen. So, here you can see these are the factors with their degree of influence on different loss mechanism of nitrogen. So, pH has high impact on volatilization, salinity has high impact on volatilization, texture has high impact on denitrification and leaching, temperature has high impact on volatilization, of course, higher temperature, higher volatilization. Organic carbon has higher importance on denitrification, and among the weather parameters, temperature has high impact on volatilization, wind speed has high impact on volatilization, rainfall has high impact on denitrification as well as leaching, fertilizer type has high impact on volatilization, leaching, amount of fertilizer will have high impact on denitrification, volatilization and leaching, placement has high impact on volatilization, and then timing has medium impact on everything. Manure application has high impact on denitrification, and crop management has almost low to medium impact. Cultivar has high impact on leaching, irrigation has high impact on denitrification as well as leaching, drainage has high impact on denitrification as well as leaching, and ground cover has high impact on denitrification as well as only for denitrification. So, if we want to see the annual fluxes of natural and anthropogenic reactive nitrogen in teragram per year, we will see this picture. So, here you can see that these nitrogen nitrogen oxides are releasing at 40 teragram per year. So, due to biomass burning, and then due to the Haber-Bosch synthesis, through fertilizer we are adding 120 teragrams of nitrogen per year, and different losses of nitrogen, nitrous oxide and ammonia accounts for 13, 5 and 60 teragrams, and fixation of the nitrogen accounts for 60 teragrams, and then also here fixation 58 teragrams, and denitrification 100 teragrams, and then atmospheric deposition 70 teragrams, and ocean deposition 30 teragrams. From ocean surface, the release of nitrous oxide and ammonia 5.5 and 9 teragrams. Denitrification from the ocean is 100 teragrams. And then the movement to the ocean from land surface is movement of nitrogen from land surface to ocean is 80 teragrams. So, you can see that how the fluxes of nitrogen can be distributed in different parts of the ecosystem. Now, environmental problems associated with nitrogen fertilizer use, we can see groundwater contamination, and basically this is due to the nitrate leaching. So, what are the mitigation strategies? Judicious use of fertilizer, increasing efficiencies, nitrification inhibitors. We have discussed about the nitrification inhibitors in our previous lecture. Coated fertilizer use. Similarly, eutrophication causes due to erosion and surface runoff of groundwater discharge. So, how to mitigate that? Reduce runoff, water harvesting, control irrigation, control erosion. Then methanoglobinemia is basically consumption due to the consumption of high nitrate through drinking water and food. So, if you reduce the leaching loss of nitrogen, that will help to reduce this methanoglobinemia. And then acid rain and ammonia redeposition is basically the responsible mechanisms are nitric acid originating from reaction of nitrogen oxides with moisture in atmosphere and ammonia volatilization. So, mitigation strategy is reduce ammonium volatilization loss, decrease the pH of the soil, increase CEC, use fertilizer formulation and inhibitors. And then stratospheric ozone depletion is basically caused by nitrous oxide emission from soil global warming, and the mitigation strategies are use of nitrification inhibitor, urease inhibitor, and we also, if we can increase the nitrogen use efficiency, that will also reduce the stratospheric ozone depletion effect. Now, plant nitrogen uptake. So, nitrogen is basically removed from the soil when it is taken up by the plant. So, plant nitrogen requirements vary depending on the plant species, production system and phases of growth. So, as mentioned previously, the nitrate form is typically the most abundant inorganic nitrogen form in the soil, but it is also more mobile. So, following the, so there is a concept of plant nutrition. So, the concept of plant nutrition says there is a 4R concept. 4R means right rate, right source, right placement and right time. So, if we maintain right rate of fertilizer, if we maintain right source of fertilizer, if we do right placement of the fertilizer and we apply the fertilizer right time, that will take care of holistically the plant nutrition. So, following these 4 R's of fertilizer management, it can help ensure adequate concentration of soil nitrogen for plant uptake and growth, while minimizing detrimental environmental impacts associated with excess mobile nitrogen in the soil. So, plant basically can take up these nitrate and ammonium, and some cases anhydrous ammonia is also being used. So, this is a simplified view of nitrogen cycle in crop production, and here from here you can have an idea about the amount of nitrogen either is in different inputs and fluxes, or I would say different different how different soil nitrogen processes are impacting the loss or gain of nitrogen. We can have a very good idea. You can see here volatilization loss. The ammonia is basically accounts for 20 teragram nitrogen per year, crop removal 85 teragram nitrogen per year, inorganic nitrogen through fertilizer 83 teragrams nitrogen per year. So, this will give you an overview of how this nitrogen cycle is affecting the crop production, and also estimated global nitrogen flows are mentioned here in each and every process. So, nitrogen inputs including from fertilizer and natural process also been called nitrogen removal efficiency, and nitrogen inputs to the system are basically denoted here by red arrow. For example, biological nitrogen fixation is biological, BNF is biological nitrogen fixation, we have discussed. Will cycle and this nitrogen will cycle through the soil, and these purple arrows are showing the immobilization and mobilization or mineralization, and also susceptible to environmental losses. So, these are the environmental losses like ammonia volatilization, nitrate runoff and nitrate leaching, and are eventually used by the crops, which are indicated by this green arrow with a portion harvested or removed. So, this is crop uptake, crop utilization. Finally, through crop removal there is a this is a loss of nitrogen from the soil. So, this shows, and nitrogen use efficiency basically we can calculate by nitrogen outputs by nitrogen inputs. We are going to discuss this in coming slides, in coming lectures in details. So, these are the references which I have used for this lecture. I hope you have got some good information in this lecture. Let us wrap up our lecture here, and let us meet in our next lecture to discuss more about soil nitrogens and soil nitrogen process and plant nutrition. Thank you.